So we've seen how the economy adjusts to a new short-run macroeconomic equilibrium when there's a shift in the aggregate demand curve. Now it's time to see how the economy adjusts to a new short-run macroeconomic equilibrium when there's a change or shift in the aggregate supply curve. So let's initially assume, again, that our economy is in equilibrium. So we have our downward sloping aggregate demand curve and our upward sloping aggregate supply curve. And the economy is in equilibrium at the price level PL0 and the equilibrium level of real GDP, RGDP subscript 0. And the economy experiences some sort of change that shifts the aggregate supply curve. Perhaps this change is a decrease in wages across the economy, or an increase in worker productivity, or maybe it's a decrease in oil prices. But whatever the factor, it has led to a rightward shift in the aggregate supply curve. It's led to an increase in aggregate supply, as represented by the aggregate supply curve moving to AS1. Now we're no longer in a short-run macroeconomic equilibrium. At the price level PL0, we now see that households, businesses, and government want to purchase the same quantity of output as they did before, but businesses now want to produce and are producing a much greater output level. And because businesses are producing a much greater output level than the households, businesses, and government want to purchase, there's an unintended increase in inventories. And that unintended increase in inventories is going to put downward pressure on the general price level. And so the general price level is going to start to fall. And as that price level falls, because businesses' production costs are sticky, it's going to cause a fall in profits for those businesses. And decreasing profits for the businesses mean they have less incentive to produce output. And so businesses start to reduce their production, and we start moving down and to the left along our aggregate supply curve. But at the same time, when that price level falls, it's increasing the real value of household assets. It's increasing the real value of household wealth. And because the real value of household wealth has increased, there's an increase in consumption by those households. And so we are moving down and to the right along our aggregate demand curve. So that lower price level is causing a decrease in aggregate supply and an increase in aggregate demand, and the two are moving towards their new intersection. A new intersection that's at a lower price level, as represented by PL1, and a higher level of real GDP, represented by RGDP subscript 1. And so the economy is automatically adjusting to its new short-run macroeconomic equilibrium associated with the increase in aggregate supply and the aggregate demand curve. And because this new short-run macroeconomic equilibrium is at a lower general price level and a higher level of output, what the economy is going to be experiencing is some deflationary pressure. But at the same time, because real GDP is increasing, it's likely to be experiencing lower unemployment. So unemployment's decreasing for this economy along with the deflationary pressure. Now let's see what happens when there's a decrease in aggregate supply. So again, let's assume that the economy is in a short-run equilibrium. So we have our upward sloping aggregate supply curve, AS0, our downward sloping aggregate demand curve, AD, and the economy is in a short-run macroeconomic equilibrium associated with the intersection between the aggregate supply and aggregate demand curves. So the economy is at the general price level, PL0, and the level of real GDP, RGDP subscript 0. And now there's a decrease in aggregate supply. This decrease in aggregate supply could have been caused by an oil price shock. Perhaps oil prices have increased dramatically. And because oil prices have increased dramatically, the aggregate supply curve shifts to the left. You have the decrease in aggregate supply, moving the curve from its original position, AS0, to a new position described by AS1. So we're no longer in a short-run macroeconomic equilibrium. Now at the price level PL0, we see that the quantity of output businesses want to produce is at a lower level, while households, businesses, and government still want to purchase the same quantity of output that they were purchasing before. And so generally, the economy is experiencing an unintended decrease in inventories. And that unintended decrease in inventories puts upward pressure on the general price level. So the price level starts rising from PL0. Now that increase in the general price level means businesses are becoming more profitable. Their production costs are relatively sticky. They get a higher price for the goods and services that they're providing, and their profits are increasing. And those higher profits give them incentive to increase their production. And so we move up and to the right along our aggregate supply curve. At the same time, that higher price level, though, is decreasing the purchasing power of household wealth. So real wealth, the purchasing power of those assets for the households is decreasing. And that decreased purchasing power leads to lower levels of consumption for the households. And so we move up and to the left along our aggregate demand curve. And the economy is automatically adjusting to its new equilibrium, to the new point where the aggregate supply curve intersects aggregate demand. And this new equilibrium is at a higher general price level, PL1, and a lower level of output, our GDP subscript 1. So the economy has moved to a new short-run macroeconomic equilibrium. But this new short-run macroeconomic equilibrium is at a higher price level and a lower level of real GDP. And this lower level of real GDP means that unemployment has increased. Unemployment's increased at the same time that the general price level has increased. The economy is experiencing both higher unemployment and higher prices. The economy is stagnating while it's experiencing inflation. Or in other words, the economy is experiencing stagflation. Now it's time to do an activity where you see how changes in aggregate supply affect Econoland's economy.